Okay.
So, um, oh, well, I guess I didn't think about doing your bio, but I wanted to thank you for joining us today, Chad. Chad is with National Parks Conservation Association, and he is the policy director for the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition campaign. I know that whenever I have a federal policy question, he is the first person I turn to ask what is happening on the Hill. Chad, I apologize, I didn't think about a formal bio. Do you want to give a quick few words about you and your experience and expertise?
Yeah, I would be happy to. Thanks, Kristy, for the invitation to talk about my experience today. I'm happy to share what I know and try and answer folks' questions about the legislative process and how people can get engaged. I've been doing this work since 1996 when I started as an intern for an organization called AIDS Action Council. It was an organization that did advocacy on behalf of AIDS service providers across the country. And so I cut my teeth on work around healthcare, FDA reform, other issues that were important to people living with the service providers who were providing services to people living with HIV and AIDS. And then from there, I did a short stint at the Human Rights Campaign where I was working on civil rights legislation, primarily for the LGBTQ community, but we worked in partnership with civil rights organizations across the spectrum. I spent a lot of time working on hate crimes legislation and again, continuing on healthcare. And then, in 2001, I was very lucky to be hired by U.S. Congresswoman Betty McCollum, a Democrat from St. Paul, Minnesota. I was born and raised in Minnesota and was very lucky to be able to go and work for a member of the delegation of my home state, and I spent 5 years with her, and that's really where I learned a lot about the legislative process, politics, and how that kind of interacts with the public policy process, and then the appropriations process as well, all of which I'm going to try and talk a little bit about today. And then since 2005, I've actually been employed by the National Parks Conservation Association, detailed for that entire time as the policy director, as Kristy noted, for the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition. And since 2005, I've been serving in a capacity of trying to provide guidance and leadership for the coalition and helping coalition members as they look at various policy and political campaigns, or actually policy campaigns, not political campaigns. We were not able to engage in electoral work, but policy campaigns to try and make some difference for the Great Lakes. So that's a little bit about who I am and what I hope to talk about today.
Thanks, Chad. Like I said, whenever I have a national or a federal policy ask, or question, I always pick up the phone and call Chad. So I appreciate you and thank you. I wanted to thank you today for coming and talking about how some of these policies at the federal level become a bill. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to spend some time talking about how a bill becomes a law at the federal level.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, there's the Saturday morning cartoon version of how a bill becomes a law that I think everyone is familiar with. And, honestly, that's still in the kind of a bigger picture, that is still the process that needs to occur for policy to be enacted by the U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress is, in my opinion, the policy-making branch of Congress, even if they don't spend as much time doing that work as I think they should. But, it is the first branch of Congress, and it is designed to legislate, to set policy for the U.S. federal agencies. And so that Saturday morning cartoon is kind of how it does generally work. Now, there are a lot of things that go into kind of, the process. People talk about the two things you never want to see being made, sausages and legislation. There's some truth to that as well, because it can be a very complicated process. But what I've learned, is, why it's complicated is that legislating is about relationships between people, and those relationships can be complicated and not always kind of linear. And it sometimes takes a long time to build support or convincing certain people to vote in certain ways, and you really need those votes in order to enact legislation. So, with that kind of preamble, I want to it all starts right with the introduction of legislation. You can't pass something that's not been introduced in either the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate, and there's some things that I like to think about when thinking about what that means in terms of the introduction of legislation. So first of all, something to keep in mind is, there are thousands of bills that get introduced in a congressional term, and congressional terms run for 2 years. We're currently in the second session of the 116th Congress. Each Congress gets its name, a number. We're in the 116th Congress right now. There are 2 sessions of each Congress. Session 1 was in 2019, and we're now in the second session, which is in 2020. That second session will be over at the end of December, when the 117th Congress begins in January. So thousands of bills get introduced every year, and a very, very small minority of them ever get enacted into law. So there are things for folks to think about when you want to pursue legislation. Things like, is this an opportunity to message on a certain issue? Is this an opportunity to actually legislate on a certain issue? What do I mean by that? Because there's so many bills out there, sometimes members will introduce bills just to draw attention to a particular issue. Really as a way to talk about problems that are going on in their community or across the entire country. And then there are bills that get introduced that are designed to actually legislate or be passed into law. And sometimes those are the same things, and sometimes they're not. So I think it's important to think about legislation, from that perspective. Obviously, I think the goal is always to get something enacted into law. And so working with your office, with a member of Congress or different offices, is going to be really, really important in order to structure your legislation in a way that can actually draw support. And that's the other element of, thinking about, the bill introduction phase, which is, have you adequately identified the problem? Have you built your own coalitions around supporting, getting agreement around that is an actual problem? Have you looked at, have you developed have you kind of put together, your solution, and then how does that solution then get translated into federal legislation that would change existing law or setting policy at a different agency? So these are a lot of different kinds of questions and areas to think about as you're trying to create support. So if you have identified if you know what your problem is, and you've kind of identified, an area that where you think you could actually solve that problem, a particular agency, a particular program, maybe there needs to be something new that gets established through a grant program or a change in the law that requires the agencies to enforce law in a different way. You also then have to actually find someone to introduce your legislation. And so there's a whole, long kind of process in terms of trying to find who that person would be. And, there's a lot of, it takes a lot of outreach to various offices, to see, whom that might, a lot of research into the backgrounds of members who, might be more open to understanding what the problem is and kind of pursuing the solution that you want to pitch. How do you know who those people are? Well, there are online resources that can be used to give you the background of members. There are folks like me who work with different offices who can provide, answer any questions you may have. There are other organizations that do the same sort of work here in Washington and in the field. So those are also good sources of information. And then obviously, probably the best place to always start is just, talking to your own member of Congress or your senators, and seeing if they, would be willing to champion the legislation that hopefully will fix the issue that's being addressed. So that's a little bit of kind of, so that's kind of a little bit of, ways of thinking about just trying to introduce a bill. Obviously, once a bill is introduced, there's all sorts of things that I always try and think about. Obviously, trying to build support for that bill is going to be critical. So working with your champion or champions is always helpful to try and reach out to other members of Congress and see if they will join as a co-sponsor of the legislation. Every bill has a sponsor because only one member of Congress can introduce a bill at a time, but they're also often joined by co-sponsors, which are important because it can demonstrate, the breadth of support a legislative proposal can have. That breadth of support can also be important politically in terms of trying to convince people to try and move it through the legislative process too. So if you have a really big co-sponsor list, that can be really helpful to you moving forward. So working with folks to do that outreach, things to think about here, do you want to do co-sponsors before you introduce, try and get what are called original co-sponsors, or do you try and do a co-sponsor push after you introduce legislation? I personally have worked on bills where we've done both, where we've tried to build a huge amount of support before, but sometimes you just don't have the time, and so sometimes you have to build support after. An example here would be the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative bill that was introduced by Congressman David Joyce last year, where he got a lot of co-sponsors on up front, and then we spent a lot of time asking members to co-sponsor it after the bill was introduced. So a little bit of a hybrid between before and after the legislation is introduced in the U.S. Congress. So those are some things to think about in terms of once the bill is introduced, is building that support. Like that cartoon says, most bills then get referred to various committees in Congress. Those committees do oversight in a regular order. They would hold a hearing called an oversight hearing, which would kind of examine the problem that's being identified by the bill. It's not really looking at that bill yet, but it's kind of just examining the problem and taking testimony from experts. If there is an oversight hearing, that's a great way for advocates to weigh in. Even if you're not invited to testify at a hearing, you can still submit testimony and have that entered into the official record. You can either do that through just submitting the testimony through relationships that you may have through committee staff, or you can contact your member of Congress's office and ask them if they can help you to submit the testimony you want to submit for that oversight hearing record. It's a great way to raise the visibility of your problem, of the problems that are being identified, and also why the solution that's being, and also raise the visibility of the solutions that are being proposed. And the next step of that process in the committee is a legislative hearing where they're actually taking testimony on a specific proposal, like the specific piece of legislation. Here again, there will be invited witnesses who will provide testimony in person, but anybody usually can submit testimony and background and information on that legislation as part of the hearing record. Again, it's a good way to use as an opportunity to educate not only committee members, but also make sure the information you want is submitted and supports the legislative proposal. Another way of, if you're interested in drawing out specific issues, is to actually submit questions to members' offices. If you've identified, there are a lot of, so let's talk about the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. That committee has jurisdiction over the Clean Water Act. If they're holding a Clean Water Act hearing, for example, there are a number of Great Lakes members on that committee. Folks may know them. If you do, if your member is on that committee, or where you know someone on that committee, you can try and submit questions to those people so they can ask the witnesses those questions. Again, another way of trying to raise visibility of the problem and solutions of why it's important for them to take action. The next step is something called a markup. It's basically a legislative step in the process where the committee comes together officially and actually considers the bill, and it provides an opportunity in the committee for members to offer amendments to the legislation. This is also an opportunity for advocates. If the bill is coming forward, one that you like or don't like, you can work with members in the committee to try and draft amendments to the legislation. And the markup is where the amendments are offered and debated, and then they get voted on. And working through that process, there is then the committee votes on that final legislative package as amended or not, and it's called reporting out. They don't actually officially vote on the bill itself. They vote on reporting out the bill to the full House of Representatives. It's a kind of a technical jargony kind of way of talking about voting on the bill, but they report the bill out to the full House of Representatives, where it gets filed. Doesn't always get filed right away. Oftentimes they want to write a report that is associated with that bill. The report describes the legislative action, it describes the problem, it describes what the legislation is attempting to do to solve the problem. It often includes minority views of members who may not necessarily agree. It usually includes all the votes and the amendments that have taken place. It's a comprehensive document that kind of really establishes the legislative history of the legislation to this point. Once the bill is filed on the House floor with the clerk of the House, it does become ripe for full House action. I'm spending all my time focusing on the House. The process in the Senate is generally the same. The rules in the Senate are looser and not quite as structured. And I'm happy to talk about those differences if folks want to get into that in questions and answers. But I'm going to spend most of my time in the House because the rules there's more formal rules in the House of Representatives, and the processes are usually pretty similar in terms of just the steps that legislation takes in both bodies. So once a bill is ripe for full House consideration, there are a couple of ways that legislation gets considered in the House of Representatives. There are a series of what are called calendars. These calendars are basically just lists of legislation that's ready to go. There is a calendar that is used primarily for non-controversial bills or bills that have no real opposition. It's called the suspension calendar. The suspension calendar allows for bills to move quickly without any formal debate. Well, there is formal debate, without a formal rule, and I'll get into the distinction shortly. The suspension calendar allows for bills to come up. They get debated for 40 minutes, equally divided between a proponent and opponent. No amendments can be allowed. No amendments are allowed on these bills, and they have to pass with 2/3 majority. I think it's 2/3 majority, supermajority, which which allows them to expedite. So you see a lot of bills, a lot of post office naming bills, a lot of non-controversial bills get put onto the suspension calendar. And honestly, you see most legislation moves often through the suspension calendar because they're able to move so quickly through these non-controversial measures. For things that require or are more controversial, or perhaps are just more higher profile, then time is allotted for a full floor debate on the U.S. House, on the floor of the House of Representatives. If a bill gets on this other calendar, then the union calendar, then it requires that a rule be established. The Rules Committee establishes a rule which outlines, whether or not there will be amendments filed, what those amendments can be filed, what amendments can be filed. Often will set time limits for debate on the amendments, and the overall debate on the bill itself. Is that going to be 1, 2, 3 hours? Is it going to roll over into multiple days? Is it 10, 5, 10, 15 minutes per amendment, whatever? So the Rules Committee sets the parameters of debate, and then the House debates. The bill comes up on the House floor. Members offer amendments if they're allowed by the rule. Here again is an opportunity for advocates to try and influence the legislation, because not only can you weigh in through letters of support, asking people to take action, specific types of actions, or just drawing attention to the benefits and of specific types of amendments or provisions. You can try and line up amendments. You can point out what amendments may not be good to different members' offices. So you can do all these kinds of things. There are a lot of online portals that allow you to do that, to communicate. Members are on Twitter and Facebook and social media, so there's all sorts of ways that you can communicate. If you have more specific questions about tools that are available or want some assistance, you can call me or talk to other folks, as well, and we can provide, we can try and provide guidance, as you guys are thinking about, as folks are thinking about, what changes you might want to see made to different legislation. I do this full time as my full-time job, and I still struggle with trying to keep up with a lot of this stuff. So it is something that I'm not surprised that folks who have real jobs also would struggle to keep up. There's a lot of resources though that can help people, including myself. So let us know how we can be of service. Like I said, the full House will vote on a bill. Once it does, the Senate has to vote on it as well. Either they vote on the same bill or they vote on their own bill. If there are two different bills that are moved through the House and the Senate, again, going back to that Saturday morning cartoon, the President of the United States has to be presented with one legislative package for him or her to sign or veto. So the Senate and the House have to agree to one package, and they negotiate any differences between two proposals. Traditionally, they are supposed to do this in what's called a conference committee. It's a committee of members who come together to try and negotiate the differences. They don't always negotiate. Sometimes they'll send the bills back and forth. It's a little bit more cumbersome. It is something I've seen happen. But usually they try and negotiate through a conference committee or through leadership, just to try and smooth out all of the differences between the two bills. The most recent example of that is this package of that Congress is debating right now on the coronavirus response. The Senate was trying to move forward with just a bill that was looking at support for small businesses. The Democrats wanted to introduce something that was a little bit more robust, more help for hospitals, more help for testing. It didn't quite work out with the conference committee because they were able to pre-negotiate some of that stuff, but they had, you saw where they were able to negotiate the differences out, and now are moving forward with a bill that's going to pass the House and the Senate that's identical. And then once the Senate and the House pass that bill that's identical, it goes to the president, who will have to choose to either sign it into law or veto it. And if he signs it into law or she signs it into law, it becomes law. If they veto it, then as the Congress has an opportunity to override the veto, and that takes a very big majority to do so. And I haven't seen that happen. I'm trying to think the last time I saw an override of a veto. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but it doesn't happen. It usually doesn't happen during when there's a split between the parties, between the White House and the Congress. It takes a lot to override a veto in that scenario. So that's the legislative process. I try to identify areas where folks can engage. I hope I hope that provides some oversight, and I'm looking forward to getting into some questions.
So, Chad, I really appreciate that. There was a lot in there, and I appreciate hearing that sometimes it's hard for you to keep up, because I often ask how people do keep up. There's a few things in there, though, I'm curious about. I know in some states, if the governor, and I'm wondering if this is the same for the president, doesn't sign a piece of legislation but quietly lets it go into law. So hasn't vetoed it, hasn't signed it. Is that the case at the federal level?
Boy, you're calling me to go back to my constitutional classes. No, the president does have to sign legislation. It doesn't just automatically. No, hold on. I don't know the answer to that question completely.
It just fascinated me. I'm curious also.
Yep, I don't know the answer to that question.
That's fine.
Yeah.
And I'm also curious.
Pocket veto. Yeah, there is something called the pocket veto, which Alexis, thank you, pointed out. Although I think the president has 10 days to sign legislation. The pocket veto is at the end of the session. Yeah, I'll have to look into that. I don't know for certain. I can't remember. I have not thought about that question in a long time.
No worries. You had talked about like identifying your offices, right? And when you're putting together a piece of legislation or you're working, you have an issue that's really important to you. And you talked about starting potentially even with your own congressional members. I'm also, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like strategically looking at the congressional members and identifying, you know, who you may want to target for your piece of legislation and potentially why.
Yeah, I mean, those are all good questions and things to think about. You know, that gets into a little bit of kind of just the politics that play out behind the legislative process. I didn't get into some of that, but I think it is important as folks who are looking to pursue a federal legislative solution to a problem that you are cognizant of the politics. How have the various parties looked at the issue? How have they approached it in the past? How do they think about it? The Democrats tend to be more interested in supportive of government intervention. Republicans tend to be historically a little bit more hands-off or laissez-faire as it comes to government intervention. So how does that play a role? So those are some things to think about as you're looking at who should introduce legislation. Yes, there are lots of different questions that come to my mind, and I know often, come up in conversation with partners as we are kind of strategizing here in Washington. Who should be the lead sponsor of a legislation? What does that mean if perhaps it's a freshman member versus a more senior member? What does that mean if, for example, the chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which has jurisdiction over the Clean Water Act, is the author of a bill that amends the Clean Water Act? I think there are a number of things to think about. Senior members often have a lot of priorities that they're juggling, so potentially junior members may have more capacity and time to really work a piece of legislation. What do I mean by that? Reaching out for co-sponsorships, submitting what are called Dear Colleagues to educate their members on the issue, continuing to do outreach, hosting briefings. Senior members may not have the time or the capacity to do that. Junior members might have the time and capacity. So maybe you want a junior member to champion the legislation because they just can do more because they have more time to do it. But junior members don't tend to have as much political capital because they're new. And so they may have more trouble gaining traction. Although then again, if they're a junior member, they may be able to play the electoral card saying they need something for their election. So, so these are all things that, to think about as you're thinking about, who you would want to approach. Your member of Congress may not also be very supportive. And so who else in your state delegation, may be open or willing to listen to you and to try and pursue legislation. The other thing that also is something to keep in mind is, the more people you get to endorse kind of your legislative solution, I think the more you're going to get, the more I think people will listen or hear you or want to hear you. Because one of the things I often get told, or I experienced when I was on Capitol Hill and I, talked to offices about is, if you have a problem and this office gets presented 2 or 3 different solutions, it's really difficult sometimes for an office to be able to decide, not only from a policy perspective, but from a political perspective, which is the one they should potentially get on board with. And so if you can get that policy solution down to just one that everybody is pushing, that is really helpful, really, really helpful to members of Congress, because then they don't have to try and figure it out. Because you have to remember, when I was a congressional staff person, my portfolio was primarily natural resources, so energy, environment, agriculture. But I also did housing. I also did taxes at one point. I handled the Native American portfolio. I did labor policy for a while. So you can see, staff has a really wide, diverse portfolio, and making it, trying to hand them something that has broad-based support, both is super helpful to an office, because it allows them to move more quickly and more strategically without having to worry too much about who's in the opposition, that sort of stuff.
So as you've said, there's so much that goes into this, and I don't know that we could ever find enough time to pick it all apart. I do want to take a little bit of time and then open it up for questions, but something that I think would be really interesting, and I'm wondering if you could talk through a little bit about what is what's a federal ask, what's a state ask, what's a local ask. And I know that's not an easy, cut and dry question. I get that. And
right.
That it takes some time and practice to understand that too. But I think that could be really beneficial to this conversation as well.
Yeah, that is not the easiest question to answer, because obviously, not only do we have, we live in a kind of our federal system where we have our national government, and then we have state governments, and those governments, share power, in a very kind of unique way. And then we have the local governments, which are, created by, is usually created by units of the state government. And they also have, a role to play. The way I would probably think about it is, think about it in terms of geography, maybe. As you get geography from the Great Lakes, so as you get further away from the Great Lakes, the policy that you're trying to affect, it becomes more general. If you're in a city, they're going to try and, enact ordinances and things that are very specific to, almost down to the street level, right? I mean, they're going to be dealing with crosswalks and where to, all sorts of stuff. That's very, very specific to those particular communities. At the state level, you're getting to, a little bit of a higher level of generality. They're not going to necessarily be dealing with a pothole on Fifth Avenue in my hometown of Marshall, Minnesota, but they're going to be trying to provide a structure for cities to be able to deal with that pothole. And then when you get to the federal level, it's even at a higher level. They try to, my experience is that they try to, at the federal level, there's federal legislation. It's national in scope. The ability for it to address, in federal statute or even in federal regulation, as a very local problem is going to be very difficult. And so what I've seen most often is that federal legislation and federal law tends to set the parameters of which guide the federal agencies. So as they're writing their regulations, they're creating a framework that then can be applied generally to states and cities without having to necessarily be able to identify every specific local problem. Looking at and then there's all sorts of grant making that can occur, and those grant programs are often usually pretty high level in terms of the intended uses of those resources, and then those resources then get allocated through grant making processes, through decision boards that the agencies then set up in order to make decisions. If those funds aren't flowing through a formula that's established by federal law, then they often will be through grants that are dictated by kind of the outlines of the law that created those programs. That's not to say the federal government is not set up, or the Congress is not set up to look at very locally specific issues. There are issues, but we can talk about water infrastructure, for example. The programs around water infrastructure tend to be, like the state revolving funds. They tend to have a list of eligible uses of those funds. So basically Congress is saying, we're going to give each state a certain amount of money based on this formula. You can use it in these different ways. You can, through low interest loans or through additional subsidization that helps in the form of more grants. There's thresholds that Congress has set for those types of things. They have different types of uses for those funds, rebuilding your wastewater plant, using it for stormwater runoff, that sort of stuff. And then the states are really the states and the little cities are the ones who then identify the specific kind of, we're going to use the money we get or apply for replacing the pipes under these streets, doing these rain gardens in these places. So that's kind of how, it's one way of, I don't know if that's really been useful because but that's kind of how I generally think about it.
Yeah, what I hear is federal legislation tends to set the framework or the floor sometimes too. In case of the Clean Water Act, it's setting the federal floor in terms of water quality. The states then can choose to look at how they're going to implement that across the state, what that might look like. In some cases, they may be more stringent, which is in our case good. And then at the local level, they get really detailed and specific about these particular areas. So I do think that was helpful and useful. I want to take some time and open it up and ask everyone, feel free to unmute yourself. I think I can, and just ask questions of Chad. I really appreciate you being here and walking through this. I know there's so much more to it, and we're just scratching the surface, but I think it's been good so far. So any questions that we have?
Hi, Kristy. This is Alicia. And we just had a great call, and questions came up about federal response to the increase in climate and how it impacts in the flooding of homes of low socioeconomics and communities of color where there are limited resources to bioswales and things like green infrastructure. Is there anything that federal policy can do that can protect, because we know all politics are local, but what can we do to uplift the issues of continued illness through bacteria coming into people's homes and the lack of trees for therapeutic reasons and carbon footprint reduction? Chad, can you talk to, is that something that is on the radar?
I think yes. I think there are lots of conversations that I'm aware of, although I have not participated in personally, but colleagues at MPCA and other colleagues I hear talking about some of these issues. There are opportunities to raise the visibility of those issues through, a lot of different ways. Just there is a role for the federal government to play here. You know, there are urban forestry programs at the U.S. Forest Service that I'm aware of that is designed to plant trees in communities, for example. So these are issues that, at least in that particular case, that's an issue that I know that there is federal program and policy that has been established to assist. You know, I'm also aware of, you know, FEMA often deals with flooding, and I've seen there's been some discussion that I'm aware of around trying to make some of the FEMA programs more proactive rather than reactive, getting, you know, homeowners and businesses and cities and states to do planning before the flood, so they're not having to respond to the damages caused by a flood. And so I know that's some of the conversation that has been coming up more frequently. You know, there's always conversations too around the National Flood Insurance Program, which I'm not an expert on, but I know that's also an area where federal policy has looked at some of these flooding issues. So I do know that Alicia, the issues that you're talking about are being discussed. Again, you know, this is where, you know, you get into some you know, the ongoing education that needs to take place, you know, working with members who can, you know, raise these issues as part of those debates, you know, working with members to try and push these as priorities for some of the debates. As you can imagine, there's 1,001 different people pushing all sorts of different things here in Congress. I swear every group has their own association and everyone's pushing their own angle and stuff. And so, you know, but I do think, you know, I'm definitely hearing a lot of discussion around flooding, its impacts on individuals, homeowners, households, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to influence the nature of that conversation and continuing to do and influence, you know, the development of that federal policy or that federal legislation.
Is there anything right now? I'm sorry, Kristy.
I was just going to say, sorry, Alicia, I mean, the SRF talks a little bit about a set aside on the clean water, right? The green infrastructure, and that can support some of that flooding too. Is that still a conversation that's happening actively?
Yes, the state revolving fund and the move towards trying to ensure that there are more resources available to communities that are trying to address that stormwater, that flooding that is caused and because of the stormwater runoff is something that is being pursued, and has been. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that moved through one of the committees, Transportation Committee last fall, and I know is potentially ripe for being included in a larger kind of stimulus package in response to the COVID-19 crisis, if Congress is able to put together a fourth stimulus package later this year. Alicia, you're going to ask another question. Sorry.
That's okay. The next part was, are we looking at public health as what you said, the COVID-19 issues, as part of looking at additional funding for environmental issues, looking at public health as we've talked about housing, we've talked about public health, and all of them are together, they're interrelated. How are we writing, or do you see a shift in the writing to look at public health as it relates to water infrastructure and environmental justice?
I definitely see a larger part of the conversation just in the last year especially, but increasingly over time. Not really focus, but really kind of an increasing part of the conversation is about environmental justice and kind of the equity around the investment of federal resources into communities. You know, I'm not probably the best person to answer the question around public health. The acts that I personally come into contact with most often, like the Clean Water Act, have as their basis, you know, kind of water quality, which is kind of health, like a health standard. But that's not direct to your point, Alicia. I mean, raising the public health point is I think what you're getting at, which is spot on. And I think there is an increasing kind of conversation around bringing public health into the dialogue and debate, or especially as it relates to water and water infrastructure. For example, the whole conversation around lead, I mean, a lot of that was led by public health people and doctors who not only raised, and communities impacted to it too, or amazing in kind of raising the visibility of that. But the voices of those doctors also were front and center, and at least the discussions I saw here in Washington is around the Flint lead crisis, for example. And so, and then with the COVID-19, you definitely are seeing, that linkage between, why clean water is so important, not only to just people, but for their health. So it is an issue that is definitely gaining a lot more visibility.
Thank you.
Really great questions. Anybody? Yeah, go Brandon.
Hey, Chad, this is Brandon. I am
Hi.
curious about the legislative process. What changes in the legislative process when there is an emergency, opposed to everything being okay, in the sense that water restoration has been something that needed to be tackled for years, and all of a sudden it seems like there's a dynamite under. And I understand that COVID is a extraordinary circumstance, but does the legislative model itself change all that much from regular to emergency?
In this case, in the COVID case, it does, because members of Congress can't congregate together and debate legislation. So yes, it definitely changes the nature of how Congress functions. And actually tomorrow in the House, they'll be debating a rule that will allow for members to vote by proxy. So members don't have to come necessarily back to Washington in order to vote on legislation, which will give them hopefully some more flexibility in actually having more robust debates. So in theory, that will allow for the legislative process to mimic the process I outlined earlier. Because right now, interestingly, members have to actually be present. You have to have a quorum of over 50% of members, in the chamber, well, not in the chamber, but they have to have a quorum in order to actually conduct business, and you have to be present in order to have a quorum right now, because we're supposed to be physically distant from each other, it's hard in a chamber, so they are trying to change the rules. I think I think an interesting question kind of associated with the one you asked, Brandon, is why does it take a crisis for members to act on certain issues? And I don't know if I have the answer to that question. I think sometimes the crisis helps focus people's attention on what's most important. There's also we can get into a whole conversation around the politics around pre and post crisis, current and post crisis. It's just sometimes, it sometimes takes a long time for problems to be, at least in the U.S. Congress, for problems to be brought up, legislation to be developed, and it takes sometimes a long time to build that coalition of people. And sometimes the crisis is what it requires to sharpen the focus of even members who may not be fully supportive, or at least at a minimum to overrun them and overrun their objections, because what's going on is so acute and people need so much help that some of the objections just become, they're able to just kind of charge on through.
Understood. Yeah, the biggest question was in terms of speed of the process, and you have answered that question. So thanks a bunch.
You bet.
Anybody else have any other questions for Chad? Let's see.
I want to go back to your question, Kristy, about the president and their abilities. I mean, so I wasn't able to think about it, but through the help of my colleague Alexis at MPCA, he sharpened my memory through his keen research.
It's important to have teams.
So it is important to have teams. They make all of us look good. So this is my looking good at his, because of his hard work. So yes, there is the pocket veto, which is what occurs at the end of the session. If the president does not sign or veto a bill, it does become law after 10 days, not including Sundays. Apparently Sundays are still a day of rest, even for the president of the United States, when it comes to enacting federal legislation. So, so it does probably work somewhat similarly to some of the state processes.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, and he actually put some useful, he put an infographic in the chat, Zoom group chat for everyone, how a bill becomes a law. So I appreciate that. Are there other questions? I know, as I said, there are a lot of times that, like, as I'm reading through legislation, which I tend to go to Thomas Library and type in Thomas Library of Congress, right? That's where, and type in, you know, keywords to find pieces of legislation, and I'll start reading through it. And if I have questions, I end up calling Chad about, like, who's engaged on this, who should I talk to, who are the key players. So I really appreciate having that relationship. But that is a useful tool, is Thomas Libraries. And as Chad said, what in my experience, I find that things aren't posted really quickly. And it's hard to find information sometimes. So it might be good to just reach out to the office for that piece of legislation if it was just introduced. Well, I guess if there's no other questions, Chad, I just thank you for your time. We've recorded this. We'll certainly put this link out, and I'll send you it as well. Again, really appreciate all that you have parted with us today, and look forward to future conversations. Thanks so much.
It was great. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for
everybody.
joining, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Stay safe.